Welcome to today's De Morgan Foundation lunchtime lecture entitled Evelyn De Morgan and the Sea. And it's my pleasure as director of the De Morgan Museum to welcome Lydia Virr. Lydia has just finished her undergraduate degree at Durham University, and today we'll be talking about Evelyn De Morgan and the Sea, some research that she's undertaken as part of her volunteering with the De Morgan Foundation. Thank you so much, Lydia. I'll hand over to you.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Thanks very much for letting me do this. I have loved researching Evelyn. I think she's absolutely fascinating, and I hope you enjoy what I have today. Great. So the sea has long been a source of inspiration for artists who have endeavoured to capture the essence of its magnitude in painting. It's a place of wonder, discovery, and beauty, but it also holds potential, danger, and great mystery. When we think of 19th century images of the sea, earlier paintings come to mind, those of the Romantics. For example, this infamous work by Caspar David Friedrich, Monk by the Sea. In the painting, we see the immeasurable vastness of the water as it stretches across the canvas. Within Friedrich's composition, divided horizontally into land, sea, and sky, the figure of the monk almost disappears into the landscape. The lonely figure is barely visible amid the vast blackness of the sea. Or one might think of Turner's numerous depictions of the sea's breathtaking power. In The Shipwreck, there is a stark contrast to Friedrich's vast and more abyss-like presentation of the water. Turner gives lucid attention to the details of the storm. The white torsos of the waves pose a menacing threat to the mariners tossed about aboard the ships. Scenes like this of shipwrecks and other disasters were popular themes within the oeuvre of Turner's artwork. Like in the opening of Shakespeare's The Tempest, we are situated in media res, in the middle of the ensuing storm, amid the chaos of the breaking waves and the crisis of potential fatalities. The physicality and the terror of the sailors gives dramatic realism to Turner's painting. It demonstrates the sheer power of the sea beside the frailty of man, who are completely weak in the face of these immovable natural forces. Now, Evelyn De Morgan, the focus of today's talk, repeatedly featured the sea in her painting. Her work comes after the Romantic style of painting that we've just seen, coinciding with the Pre-Raphaelite movement in the mid to late 19th century. But dissimilarly from the Romantic painters, Evelyn recognised the allegorical and symbolic potential of pictorial representations of the sea. As you can see in these selected images, water featured heavily across the oeuvre of not only Evelyn's paintings, but also of her husband, William, in his ceramics. William's depictions of the sea mainly featured galleons or ships as symbols of human power and workmanship, whilst Evelyn's paintings are of allegorical spiritual expression, often inspired by classical mythology. She paints these ephemeral figures rising above the water, often encompassed by rainbows or stars. Viewing the sea as a place of both danger and beauty, Evelyn's paintings highlight the Victorian fear and fascination with the water, and especially the mystery of what lurked beneath the waves. Her artwork is embedded in the Victorian social shift between epistemological concerns and scientific advances, expressing the symbolic limit of human knowledge. These paintings look under the surface, featuring fictitious sea creatures, which call into question the bounds between science and myth, knowledge and mystery. My talk is going to focus primarily on this set of 3 paintings that Evelyn produced of the sea. These paintings took inspiration from Hans Christian Andersen's tale, The Little Mermaid. But first, we're going to have a brief look at other Pre-Raphaelite versions of the myth of the mermaid. As you can see in this set of paintings, the depictions of mermaids and so-called water women were very varied among the central figures of the Pre-Raphaelite movement. But more commonly, these pictures depicted sirens and femme fatale figures. Sirens were alluring mythological creatures who used the power of their voices to entice sailors to their deaths. The subject of the dangerous woman, or femme fatale, flourished in the 19th century, not least among the painters of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Hence the fear and fascination associated with these sirens of the sea. When describing the central figure in his 1877 work, A Sea Spell, Rossetti said of it, "The idea is that of a siren or sea fairy whose lute summons a seabird to listen, and whose song will soon prove fatal to some fascinated mariner." As Rossetti alludes to, these sirens were threatening, mythological women, feared because of their deceptive beauty and as well as their potent voices. The subject of Rossetti's painting was mostly derived from a poem he wrote, which was then inscribed on the accompanying frame. This is the second stanza of the poem that I've put next to the painting. I think it's interesting how Rossetti uses spell to describe the power of the sirens. She sinks into her spell, a verb evocative of witchcraft and those feared women of the early modern period burned at the stake for having a voice. The threat of the poem seems to be at odds with the serenity of the painting. The lusciously draped fabric of her dress and the fragrant flowers bewitch the senses of the viewer. The subject too seems captivated by her own music, but this, of course, is the deceptive power of the enchantress, seducing the viewer under her spell, till he, the fated mariner, hears her cry and comes to die. This dramatic painting by Waterhouse illustrates an episode from the journey of the Greek hero Odysseus, as told in Homer's epic poem, The Odyssey. The painting shows Ulysses, who has been warned by Circe to stop the ears of the sailors with wax to prevent them from succumbing to their deaths by hearing the song of the sirens. Ulysses has also ordered himself to be bound to the mast, as you can see in the centre of the image. As such, they can have safe passage through these fatal waters. But, unlike what Victorian audiences would have expected, Waterhouse has painted the sirens according to the classical tradition, and not as mermaid-like mythical creatures with fishtails. Waterhouse took inspiration from an ancient Greek vase at the British Museum, in which the sirens were depicted as creatures who had the body of a bird and the head of a beautiful woman. By subverting traditional impressions of sirens, Waterhouse has made these female figures appear even more dangerous and imposing to the sailors. They encircle the boat with their threatening mouths open wide to sing their fatal melody. In this first of the three paintings inspired by Hans Christian Andersen's tale, The Little Mermaid, Evelyn has painted neither wings nor a fishtail on this mermaid, but legs, human legs on this unassuming girl. According to Andersen's tale, the daughter of the Sea King rescues a prince from a violent storm and falls in love with him. The little mermaid then visits a sea witch who agrees to exchange with her the soul and physical form of a human for the loss of the mermaid's own voice. As described in the painting, we can see the mermaid's fishtail has become legs, whilst at the same time losing her power of speech, therefore losing the ability to communicate with the prince of her love for him. The prince then sadly falls in love with another woman, leaving the mermaid longing to return to the sea. This quote from Andersen's Little Mermaid expresses the fateful mortality of these creatures, whose plight is their inability to pass into that glorious world above the stars when they die. The mermaid's wish, then, is not merely to procure new legs, but a whole new soul, because, according to their lack of a human soul, mermaids cannot have eternal life after death. Andersen's tale, whilst mythological, shows a comparable interest in spirituality as that which Evelyn De Morgan also displayed in her lifetime. Spiritualism is encoded into much of Evelyn's later work. The sea, in particular, is allegorized as a vehicle for rebirth after death. The practice of spiritualism diffused from America into British society during the 1850s as a metaphysical antidote to the emotional and intellectual crisis of faith in Victorian culture. It was predominantly a uniquely feminist movement, empowering a form of female self-liberation. In the painting, the Little Mermaid is not as threatening as the Sirens of the Waterhouse, but instead she is a sorrowful creature who yearns to experience human love, human physicality, and a human soul. This painting poignantly expresses Evelyn's own beliefs, bound up in spiritualism, of the transitory nature of life and the hope of the soul's transformation at the moment of death. It captures the moment in Andersen's tale where the sea maid has just received her humanity, having exchanged her mortality for human immortality. She hangs her legs into the water in a moment of pensive contemplation. Her legs are a potent symbol of her new freedom, but also more directly a symbol of her permanent exclusion from the world she has come from. She is now indelibly exiled from the sea into which she was born. On the rocks beside her lies a deep red cloth, symbolizing love and passion, whilst at the same time indicating her loss of innocence and foreshadowing her later martyrdom. The sun emblematically sets in the background upon her mortal life as a mermaid, whilst the castle rises beside her with the prospect of a new human life emerging from the horizon. In this second depiction of the Little Mermaid, Evelyn has painted the 5 older sisters of the Little Mermaid in Andersen's tale. Like the Sirens of the earlier paintings of Waterhouse and Rossetti, these mermaids have beautiful faces and flowing hair. However, beneath the frothy waves are visible beautifully scaled fishtails, as opposed to the threatening wings of Waterhouse's Sirens. If we compare it to those Sirens, where the Sirens are dangerous, alluring femme fatale figures, De Morgan's mermaids instead hold melancholic facial expressions, their cold, glassy eyes underlying their basic predicament of the lack of a human soul. In the denouement of Andersen's tale, the Little Mermaid sacrifices herself by diving into the water. She chooses to take her own life in order to spare the princes. As her body dissolves into the water, she is transformed into an ethereal spirit, a daughter of the air, for her selfless act. The quote beside the painting is from one of these daughters of the air in Andersen's story. She preaches a pseudo-gospel based upon works and doing good deeds in order to earn salvation. As such, the Little Mermaid has to work for another 300 years of completing good deeds before she can fully obtain immortality and go up to heaven. Here, Andersen's moralistic vision of a life after death somewhat echoes Evelyn's own spiritual beliefs that are frequently allegorized in her later paintings, of the renewal of a person's soul at death. This painting on the right, Daughters of the Mist, is often considered to refer to the finale of Andersen's tale that I've just described. These daughters sit amidst the clouds and rainbows. The standing figure at the top of the painting appears to stretch towards the star, as if she has just attained her immortal soul and can finally reach heaven. As we've seen then in these 3 works inspired by Andersen's tale, they express Evelyn's early interest in spiritualism and symbolism. These themes continued to remain evident throughout her later work, as she more overtly used the sea as a vehicle for spiritualist allegory. Towards the end of her life, Evelyn's seascapes more openly focused on life after death. the port after the stormy seas of human life. The metaphorical trope of water expressed her frustration at the impediments faced by women in her society. Death is pictured as the only decisive refuge for women. In the late 19th and early 20th century, Evelyn had become engaged with the women's rights movement, having signed the Declaration in Favour for Women's Suffrage in 1889. Her paintings of the sea oscillated between endorsing spiritualist values through metaphor, as well as political ideas of female enfranchisement and war apathy. Evelyn's paintings advocate for women's voices to be heard and not to be stamped out like those of the Sirens in Waterhouse's painting. Evelyn finds an allegorical escape for those so-called fallen women in the bounds of the sea. Where the water is an incessant source of chaos and violence in Turner's landscapes, it provides a source of symbolic refuge for Evelyn in her paintings. In this piece, one of Evelyn's later works, Port After Stormy Seas, her portrayal of the water becomes an allegory for the renewal of a person's soul at death. The sea is pictured as a metaphor for the toils of life and the many obstacles faced by women simply because of their sex. Death is thus a refuge and final escape for women such as this, as indicated in the peaceful expression of the female subject as she lies on the rocks. The title, taken from Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen, suggests the hope of a safe harbour in the life after death, a hope for sleep after toil. The angel of death hovers over the tempestuous seas, allowing the woman a moment of rest before they both journey into the light of safety behind her. Where the moon is almost omitted in the little sea-maid painting we looked at earlier, here it beams unspoiled beside the wild waters, emitting light and the hope of peaceful refuge in the afterlife. In this next painting, The Passing of the Soul at Death, Evelyn portrays death as the final refuge for women, just as it is in the Port After Stormy Seas. This painting also echoes themes in Anderson's tale, as the metaphorical trope of water is used once again to illustrate Evelyn's spiritual belief that upon death, a person's soul is renewed as it passes into the light of new life. The left of the portrait shows the dying female figure sitting upon the rocks, with the threatening background of a dark land, ominously loomed over by the presence of a dragon. Here, Evelyn's portrayal of the sea demonstrates both its faculty as an allegory for rebirth, as well as its darker symbolism of evil and myth. The sea in her paintings contains both dragons and mermaids, symbolizing its multiplicity, giving a sense of profound mystery and wonder. The passing of the female protagonist into the next life is aided by the spirit on the right of the painting. Just like the daughters of the air in the tale of the Little Mermaid, this spirit will guide the figure out of the shadowy land towards the light. Evelyn has painted the spirit dressed in diaphanous draperies and clouded by a rainbow, a symbol of hope and rebirth. As we have seen then, the sea was a continual source of inspiration for Evelyn. Her frequent portrayal of the sea allegorized the junction between life and death, good and evil, mortality and immortality. Evelyn's deeply personal visualization of the great mystery of the sea suggests its potential as a place of renewal, as well as a place of myth and mystery. The water provides a glimmer of hope, promising light from darkness and final peace in a world that she saw and experienced as morally corrupt and destructive for women. Evelyn died in 1919, continuing to believe that she would find a port after the stormy seas of her own life. Whilst it may have been short and her body of her life and her body of artwork continues to inspire new audiences, proving the eternality of art and its continual relevance to new generations. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed hearing about Evelyn's fascination with the sea as much as I enjoyed researching it. I'd be happy to take any questions if you have them.
Thank you so much, Lydia, for a brilliant and thoroughly researched sort of argument there for De Morgan's use of the sea as kind of a very different motif, which you highlighted through those kind of examples from other artists that came before her and from her contemporaries as well. So I thought that was brilliant. If anybody does have any questions for Lydia, you're very welcome to type those into the chat box, which we can see on our screens, and I'll be able to put them to her. So do type those, or any comments that you might have on any of the images that Lydia looked at today, either by De Morgan or otherwise. And whilst people have a think, Lydia, sort of something that kind of came into my mind as you were talking is, do you think that in De Morgan's pictures, of those which don't include the sea and are therefore obviously based on the land, whether she uses that in the opposite way to how she uses the sea, whether there's any kind of element of anchoring in the physical world that she uses that for, or is that irrelevant, do you think, in her use of the sea?
No, I definitely think it works both ways. I think in the paintings of the sea, the women that she paints are often, they're rising above the water, or they're kind of, as I said, they're these ethereal spirits, and they seem much more free, much freer than those figures who are on the land. Often they're restrained by physical impediments, whether that's walls, or there are people in the way preventing them from getting through. So I'm thinking of I think it's the Gilded Cage, or there are these women who have these very clear physical impediments, whereas in the water or in the air, these women are free and a lot more autonomous.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. So we've had lots of thanks coming through as well, which is lovely. But a question from Cecilia, who wonders if you could say anything more about the vase that inspired Waterhouse. It could be helpful for her PhD chapter on Waterhouse.
Yeah, I don't actually know much about the vase, so I didn't do too much in-depth investigation into that. But I'm sure it's still there at the British Museum. Yeah, I think that would again be a very fascinating thing to investigate. As I said, I was doing mainly the stuff on Evelyn, so I didn't do too much in depth into the other Pre-Raphaelites. But I think it's such an interesting, I'd never seen that way of representing sirens before with the wings. So I think it's such an interesting dichotomy between the tails and the wings, and that kind of, they're so much more imposing. They're these very dark, ominous figures that are flying around the ship. So yeah, I think that would be a really interesting thing to look further into, is that if there's any more classical depictions of these winged figures.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that was such an interesting image to choose from sort of the wider Pre-Raphaelite circle, as we know, Waterhouse did also depict the siren in the mermaid form, didn't he, as well, and sort of these very overly sexualized women. So I think we can sort of maybe read into that perhaps this the vase and depicting the myth in that painting, he was maybe trying to do something quite different and be almost historically accurate, in inverted commas, versus the other pictures of mermaids that he does.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and is with Waterhouse, as you mentioned, there's that very famous picture that I think I put up on the slide of the mermaid combing her hair, and that's a completely different picture to those sirens. She's, as you said, very overtly sexualized, and she's got I think she's got a very similar facial expression to those of Evelyn's mermaids, but I think it's a very different take on the kind of power of and femininity of these women.
Lovely. So a question from Jane is, do we know what places De Morgan visited in order to inspire the seascapes that she painted?
I think I'm pretty sure she visited Woolacombe Bay in Devon for I think at least one of the paintings. I'm sure, Sarah, you'd know more about that.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. She visited the Woolacombe Bay, as you mentioned, and that was for the Port After Stormy Seas picture. So we have that referenced in one of her diaries, that's kind of a direct link between that kind of exact landscape. But kind of more generally, Evelyn and her husband William were quite almost obsessed with the sea. So they travelled a lot to Italy between 1890 and 1914, and of course train travel would have been available to them, but instead they always chose to go by boat. So they always travelled to Italy, taking a lot longer than in carriages and trains, but talked a lot in sort of letters about how that part of the journey was quite inspirational to them. So even though some of these seascapes that you've included, Lydia, are, like you mentioned, they're very ethereal, they're very evocative, they're suggestive of the sea rather than being real places. She did have that first-hand kind of experience of the sea and its enormity, and I'm sure that kind of gave her the idea for some of these pictures. And Cecilia's added that she also visited Weymouth when she was younger several times, so international and national waters. Are there any other questions or comments? I don't know if you can see the chat box, Lydia, but there are lots
I've got it
of coming through, which is lovely to see. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks very much.
And unless there are any other questions, we shall leave it there and let everybody get on with their Friday afternoons.
Great, fab. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lydia, and thank you everybody for coming today. Give me a couple of hours, but I will get the talk up on YouTube. So if anybody wants to check anything for a point of reference again, then that should be on YouTube later this afternoon. If you're watching on YouTube, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Good afternoon.